Well, good morning, church. It's great to be with you this morning. And thank you so much, Bronwyn, for that great story about bees and about your backyard and how everything's just buzzing so nicely there. I really love that. I don't know about where you feel closest to God, but as I've traveled around and I've asked young people that question over the years, and I'm not so young anymore, I get that one of the most common answers that I actually have received to that question is they feel closest to God where? Where do you think? In the nature, in out of doors. Why not? Because that's the place where as you stand there at the top of a cliff, that you've climbed a mountain, and there you are, you're looking out, and it's incredible. They're the moments that you go, oh, wow, that's beautiful. Takes your breath away. Those kind of magic moments. Absolutely beautiful. However, our world's changing. And I remember when I was about 15, 16, that Dora Creek would flood every year. Then they dredged it and it no longer floods. And now it no longer rains. It's like, what's going on, right? It's just amazing. It's like the last time we had a decent flood rain, I rode along the back of college there on the mountain bike, and my front wheel was underwater. My mobile phone in the pocket got wet. It was like, all right, that was a lot of water, but it's been a long time since we had decent rain. And as I said this morning in Sabbath school, as I travel around our conference and see, I just see that there's so much dryness around that we're going to need an awful lot of water just to break through the crust. It's so rock hard. And our world is changing. But here's my big idea. Because what do you believe about the environment? Is the environment something that God has given us? Well, as a Christian, I believe He's kind of like created the world. And is it a resource that we can use any way we like? There are certainly some people in the world with Christian beliefs who believe that that is true. So they go around, rape, pillage, and plunder the countryside and think it's great. And I guess the thought that I want to challenge you with today is, where does your faith fit into that equation? And what you believe about all of that really is going to, I think, alter the kind of behaviors that you might do. Let me explain a little more. Does your theology affect the way you relate to the natural world around us? It should. Like God created the world, and I happen to believe, that God created the world in just 6 days. In fact, you could actually ask, instead of saying, why only 6 days? It's like, well, why didn't you just do it in 6 seconds? God could have just said, let the whole world exist. There it is. But He did it in 6 days. Man sinned, and we go and we wreck it all. We blow it. And as a consequence of that, we get the first of many cascades that would happen in the world. And the cascade is that we now get sin into the equation, and humanity starts being at odds, not just with themselves in relationships, but also with the environment. And then the world starts to grow tired. Humanity places a massive toll. I was talking to someone just this week, and they were talking about chains. I don't know what the biggest chain you've seen is. Maybe on a boat, one of those big chains that comes down for the anchors. Well, imagine a chain that size, if you've seen one, behind the back of a D9 bulldozer. And what they're doing is they're just towing that through paddocks in North Queensland, just basically pulling every tree over in a 100-metre kind of block at a time as they just sort of scrape the countryside and just clear it ready for farming. It's like, all right, what we're doing to our planet. I mean, if you look at a satellite photo of the South Island of New Zealand, before Pākehā, which is a derogative term for white people, arrived in the South Island of New Zealand, there were trees over most of that land. And now they're only there in the alpine regions. It's just like, all right, we just wanted to clear the land for farming. But all of our activity as humans on the planet comes with a consequence. And we know that as Adventists, we look at Matthew 24 and we say, well, look, Jesus is coming soon. Jesus said, well, look, there'd be famines, earthquakes, pestilences, and all of these things would be just the beginning of the end. So we know that things are going to get worse and not better. So we might as well just say, well, why bother? Right? Ever been in that category? Like, it's all going to burn anyway. I mean, isn't that what Peter says, that in the end, when Jesus comes, it's all going to be destroyed in fervent heat. So let's not worry about it, because Jesus is going to create a new heaven and a new earth. Can you see the logic in that? So let's just give up in a sense of hopelessness now and just think there's nothing we can do. So let's just unpack, what does the Bible actually say about ecology anyway? And in Genesis chapter 1, we just get beautifully just told in such wonderful poetic language how God created the world. He creates the spaces for things in the first 3 days, and then he fills those spaces in the next 3 days. He creates the atmosphere, and then he fills the atmosphere with birds, and the sea with fish. And then he creates light, and then he puts the sun, moon, and stars in those things. And then he creates land, and he populates the land with animals and creatures and humanity. And here it is, a beautiful poetic lineup that's there if you take the time to look at it. And then in Genesis 1, we're told that God places us in the garden. He created us to be caretakers of this earth. So, on a rating of 0 to like 10, where do you think we're doing as caretakers at the moment? Come on, what do you think? Are we, with 0 being really bad caretakers and 10 being like really outstanding caretakers, humanity as a whole, where do you think we're sitting? Naught? You're going down here like we're way down here at 0? We're close to 0? Oh, wow. We're close to 0. Like, one of the things, it's not a verse that I've listed there, but in Genesis 3, we're told that one of the consequences that God said is that now humanity is like us, knowing good and evil. Actually, there's another way of interpreting that verse, which actually is probably more true. It's that now man no longer knows what evil is. A Hebrew scholar just shared that with us last year, and I'm like, wow, that puts a whole different perspective on things. Because we no longer know what evil is, so what do? Well, we'll put a highway through and watch kangaroos get killed every night and just think, well, that's just the price of living in Australia and it's okay. I joined the Kangaroo Club a couple of years ago. It cost me $800. I'm a signed up member now. But I grieve every time I see a kangaroo dead beside the road. They're beautiful creatures. They're our national emblem. And I'm proud of the fact that we're putting fences down our freeways now, but we don't have enough fences. We don't have enough crossing points for wildlife. It's like we're willing to do so much to this country of ours, and yet we're not willing to actually take care of it as stewards would. And so where do we fit in that? Psalm 50, verses 8 to 12, talks about the earth and everything that's in it belonging to God, that the earth is His and the fullness therein belongs to God. And God has placed us here in this world to be the custodians of it. We know this because it's one of our fundamental beliefs as Adventists, this idea of stewardship, that we are the stewards of this earth, as well as the stewards of our time and our money and our resources. We're stewards of all of that because they're all things that God has blessed and given us for us to deal with. Yeah? In Exodus 20, let's look at this. It's time we open our Bible. So let's go to Exodus 20 for a moment. In Exodus 20, and we're told here to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. And I love that word remember because that word remember forces us to look backwards in the past. And as we look backwards in the past, what we notice is that God calls us to remember His creative work. And what I want you to realize is that at the heart of being a Christian, at the heart of being an Adventist, is a remember of God's creative work. And you're like, okay, this guy is talking to us about eco-theology. Like, wow, am I going to come green at the end of the sermon? Am I going to have to go out and hug trees? I must confess, I am a tree hugger. I've lived 2 lots of 7 years in South Island, New Zealand, in Christchurch. Survived 10,000 plus earthquakes, by the way, with Andrew and our family. That was something else. But whenever I felt like I was missing gum trees, and that was reasonably often, there was one place in the Botanic Gardens in Christchurch where they had this giant red river gum. And I would go there, and honestly, Murray, just hold your hand there. So there's Murray, this is me, that's about the girth of the tree. And I would go up to this tree, it was like 150, 200 years old whenever, they planted it early. And I would just go up and I'd just go, oh. And then we'd try and measure it, and we'd get our kids and we'd measure how many of those around the tree it was. But it was just great because in that moment I'd get this connection with the trees back in Oz. This one tree in the garden there. Just incredible. And it's this tree that's seen so much. And it's a magnificent, grand tree. That photo, by the way, that you see there in that image, does anyone recognize where it is? Yeah, well now you can read it, right? It's the head of the Darling River. But actually what you don't realize is that's you get the iPhone out and you do this. So it's actually 180 degrees that you're looking at, and there's 2 rivers joined to form the head of the Darling River. But what you don't see very well in that image is right there, there's a whole pile of rubbish. It's like this is the head of like the most significant river system in Australia, and it's just like there's rubbish just sitting right there. And this is just outside of the little town of Walgett in our conference. And it's like, wow. So God reminds us, wants us to remember His creative work every week we come together. And I think, wow, what a blessing that is, that we should connect with the bush and the natural world in this way. Matthew 28 goes on, and let's look at Matthew 28 for a second. It's a memory verse. We barely even need to look it up. So Matthew 28, and says this, where Jesus, just giving His disciples the last command, says to them, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me, so go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you, and lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. The keys of God's kingdom has been given to Jesus. Jesus then sends us out with authority in His name to go and to do the work of converting and saving people and teaching. And I think a part of that, like our missionaries understood this, because we would go into villages in Papua New Guinea and we wouldn't just leave them in a mess. Their villages would get cleaned up and their lives would become more sanitized as ecological practices would come into the village, and suddenly people's lives would be totally transformed. We're told in Matthew 6:23 that you shouldn't let your good deeds of charity be known, so that your left hand doesn't know what your right hand's doing. And I guess in many respects that's been the philosophy driving ADRA for so many years, which is why we don't advertise on TV and in lots of other places, because we just sooner do our good works without sort of trumpeting it in the marketplace that look how good we are. And that's a good thing. And we also know about social welfare and how we're to care for the poor and the needy in our midst. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing any of those things. Because we should. We must. It's what it means to be human, is to care. But I would want to suggest as well that what it means to be human is to care for more than just people. But it also means to care for God's creation. That little island is an island just off the main island of Fiji. Like you go to Denarau, you fly and you land in Denarau, and then you catch one of those little boats and you go out there and you island hop for a day. Look how low to the ground, to the sea that island is. Notice that? It might be gone in the next 50 years. Like this week, Scott, our Prime Minister was there in the Pacific at Tuvalu, and as he was talking in there, the Pacific Island nations were saying, hey, waving a very strong flag of protest, saying, hey, we want you to step up and to do something. Now, I'm not politicizing it, I'm not being for or against government. All I really want to raise the flag is to say, hey, some of these things really matter, and there's an urgency and a time factor to this that really comes in. And Ellen White says this, she says, nature and revelation alike testify of God's love. The sunshine and the rain that gladden and refresh the earth. The hills and the seas and plains all speak to us of the Creator's love. I mean, you look at an island like that, and it's just this natural beauty. It's magnificent. And it just speaks of a God who supplies the daily needs of all His creatures. In the beautiful words of the psalmist, we get this: the eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at the proper time. You open your hand, and you satisfy the desire of every living thing. God made man perfect, holy, and happy, and the fair earth as it came from the Creator's hand was what? There was no decay. There was no death and destruction. That's what's come as a result of our humanness, or if you like, our inhumanity. Because it's our inhumanity that drives this. It's our selfishness, our greed, our want and lust for power and for more stuff. God is love is written upon every opening bud, every spire of the springing grass, the lovely birds, the koalas in the trees. Only the koalas in the trees are losing the habitat at frightening rates. And I get an email from one of our pastors who bugs me a little bit because he sends so many emails. Right? I guess it's my job to read them, it's his job to send them, so it's all right. We're both fully employed, just me reading his emails coming through and him generating them. And at the bottom of his email is this little tagline which says, for evil to prosper, good people just need to do nothing. It's a real truth to that, right? And the silent majority of Australians are good people. But are we doing nothing? Are we asleep at the wheel in terms when it comes to thinking about this? And what I want to suggest is our theology should actually cause us to be more environmentally conscious than perhaps what we really are. And I know, in some respects, I'll be speaking to the converted here, because I know there are many people in the room here who care even a lot more passionately about the environment than I do. But I want to bring it to us as an issue. Deuteronomy 6:5 says this. It says to love the Lord your God with what? All your heart, all your strength, all your soul, all your mind, and to love your neighbour as yourself, right? That's the Shema. Have you ever played at the beach, Lyndon? You're there at the beach, you're playing, you're making a sandcastle, or having a righteous time. And as you're playing and you're making your sandcastle and you're getting it all just so, a wave comes in, threatens your sandcastle, you beat the wave back, but just down the beach there's an ignoramus there and they're playing rugby. And you know what's coming because as the camera has just been focused on you and your family doing your thing, making your sandcastle, it now pans out for a broader image of the beach. And what happens next, people? The what? The ball comes. And then what? And hits the sandcastle. So it's just the ball. See, in my version of events, it's not the ball. It's some guy running who catches the ball and trumps his feet straight over the sandcastle. And that sandcastle is the late, great planet Earth. And we're the people chasing the ball. And God's the one who's made the sandcastle. He fashioned it with His hands. And yes, I could talk about the ecology today. I could also talk about sex slaves and the sex trade that actually goes on in the world. Did you know that when the most sex trafficking actually takes place is at the world's largest sporting events? So In Australia, that would mean State of Origin night in Sydney, State of Origin night in Melbourne, State of Origin night in Brisbane. Those nights, there'd be more suffering. On those nights as well, there'd be more domestic violence. That's our inhumanity bubbling up. And while all of that is true, what I want to talk about here today is we should do something about that, as we should also do something about caring for our world in which we live, so that we can pass on a world to our kids in the future. Oh, what I need to also say about that photo is the man there is now the president. His name is Eric. He's the president of the Cook Islands. I wonder what he's thinking about his homeland. He's actually Samoan. I don't know, he married a Cook Islander. I guess that makes him almost Cook Island. But the locals like him enough that they made him president. He's a beautiful man. But his homeland is threatened. How do we show love for someone we can't see? I don't know if you've ever thought about that as a question. By respecting his property, would that be useful? I think it would. By loving what he has made, by caring for the things that he cares about, by basically having the same heart that God has, which is a love for his created world. That I would be a lover of people just as I would be a lover of the created world, and I'd be wanting to care for that. Revelation 11:18. Let's look at this verse. Revelation chapter 11 and verse 18. It's an interesting verse. There's a couple of ways you can actually read this verse to understand it. But Revelation 11 and verse 18 is talking about the end. And you start there in verse 16. And the 24 elders who sat before God on their thrones fell on their faces and worshipped God, saying, "We give you thanks, O Lord God Almighty, the one who is, who was, and who is to come, because you have taken your great power and reign." God is ruling. "And the nations were angry, and your wrath has come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants, the prophets, and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who destroy the earth." Now that idea there of destroy the earth, you could understand the meaning of that in two ways. You could understand that in terms of moral corruption. That the people on the planet are so morally corrupted that's how they destroy the earth. But you can also think of it as in actually just destroying the ecology of the planet. One of the things that I get to do is every now and again I get to jump on a little light aircraft and fly out from Cessnock out west. Haven't done it much lately because I've preferred to drive instead. Yeah, I know, I'm crazy. But as I fly out over the top of the Hunter Valley, guess what I see? Something that as a child I would never have seen. First we had Ravensworth open cut coal mine, and now we've got like 30 others. They are terrible. And the big idea that government lets them get away with is not that they fill in as they go, and so they move the hole along, but at the end, there's just going to be a hole left in the ground. It's just like, what are we doing to our planet? And why do we let our politicians get away with that? If we go back in our history as Adventists, about 140 years, 159 years, to be precise. And we're in 1860s America. What was happening in 1860s America? The Civil War. The war, the North against the South, for the freedom of slaves. Guess how many articles the Adventist Church wrote to the government of its day? Around 200. Articles just protesting and saying the government ought to step in. You as Prime Minister or as President, Abraham Lincoln, you need to do something. In fact, we've got a hymn in our hymn book, 606, which actually is a hymn or as a poem written to Abraham Lincoln saying, "Once to every man and nation is the moment to decide. Do you stand for what is right or do you stand for what is wrong? Because now is your moment." It's a beautiful hymn. And in the middle of that, comes the challenge of the church is writing, saying, hey, let's do something. At the same time, our church is so busy doing mission work. And we're also so busy as part of the freedom fighters movement, getting people out of the south and into the north. Our pioneers were really incredible social activists. Go forward 100 years from that into the 1960s. And our church is faced with another social uprising in America, and this time it's civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King and others. And our church now only writes 2 articles. And both of them are in the Adventist print. So it's not to government, it's just to ourselves. And the advice is, let's not get involved in issues of a political nature. It took until around 1980 for the General Conference to no longer have an apartheid meeting rooms for lunch. They had a white room for lunch and a black room for lunch up until the late 1970s, early 80s. Now I look at that and I think, what's happened to our church that we no longer care about the things that really should trouble us and that should cause us to actually have a voice? Our nation has religious liberty enshrined in its constitution because more than 100 years ago, Adventists advocated to the government of the day that religious liberty was something worth defending. Your religious liberty today is enshrined in the Constitution because of our Advent pioneers. Small in number though they were, they understood the issues and they advocated for it. These little creatures, they're actually on Honeymoon Island in Aitutaki. If you go back to that one, that's the parent, that's the new chick. Red-tailed tropic bird. Beautiful. You can get right up close. You can actually touch them because they're so trusting, I guess, because their contact with humanity has been so, I guess, untroubled, for want of a better word. It's just incredible. But there's cascades happening in our world at the moment that are just absolutely unbelievable. There's a book that, if you're at all interested in the environment, I'd recommend you actually get a hold of it, have a read. You'll be depressed in no time at all. If you're, just take that on advisement. But it's called The Uninhabitable Earth. I saw this in the hands of a guy in Melbourne Airport, and I said, mate, where'd you get that from? It sounds like something I should read. And he said, I just in a bookshop, and he told me where, and so I tracked it down and got my own. And it's not a regret. I read that and I'm just like, wow, what's happening in our world we should be alarmed about. This photo here that you see, Wendorfer's Forest Walk in Tassie, represents the old growth forest of Tasmania. I couldn't get a photo of the forest that's actually burnt last summer, in January of this year. But in the national parks, in the wilderness areas of Tasmania, they had unprecedented fires. Now, they've had fires before, but these were unprecedented, according to the reports that came out of the fire people and the national parks people. Why? Because Tasmania was almost it was in heat wave conditions. And then we go it was burning. And then we go to the fish kill at Menindee Lakes, and Debbie Newt, who's a worker out there, on her Facebook feed, she posted these photos. And as she posts them, what she's actually saying is, hey, look what's happening to our largest river system in Australia, and what are we doing to it, and how are we caring for it, without actually even talking about the ecology of the soils that we farm out there, and how the salinity of the soil is so degraded because of the fertilizers we use, and on it goes. It's just wherever humanity goes, we're making a mess. And then this came out in the news just last week, or the week before. 6 giant warehouses like this, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. Because of the rubbish that we produce as a country. We can no longer ship it to China, and other countries don't want it. Like, why should we ship our rubbish somewhere else? Let's just stop making rubbish. And then this is where it ends up. I have a photo, but it was such low quality that I actually couldn't put it up, of a mission trip I did into Cambodia. We stayed in what, for their standards, would be a 4-star hotel. And it's right on a river that would go into, would eventually flow into the Mekong River, the largest river through Asia. But right outside the motel, there's a little ramp going down into the river, and the river, that little ramp was the garbage dump. It's like beautiful. Every time the monsoons come through, it just picks up the rubbish and floats it all away. It's gone. It's just wonderful. What a mess. What a mess. And now we know where it all ends up. In these giant patches floating around in the ocean. Huge patches of rubbish. And then you get albatrosses on Midway Island that are flying around, and what are they doing? They're trying to feed the young, and so they go and they're flying across and they see floating in the water these bits of plastic which look to them very much like squid and fish. They go down, they get a belly full of that, they come back and feed it to their chicks, and the chicks are dying at unprecedented rates, and this is one of them. And it's just all the plastic that's inside. Why? Because we as a society think that actually getting plastic's a really good idea because it's so convenient. So for the sake of our convenience, we're destroying our world. And I'm disturbed by that. Then we get this, and I need to talk to you a little bit about this graph here, because that little graph there, it's humidity here. So if someone's got a weather app, can you just look up the temperature in Morisset at the moment and the humidity in Morisset at the moment? We'll have a look. So last night the humidity was around 80%, which is right through there, that line. And the temperature outside today is probably around 22 degrees, which gives us an index of around 29 or 28, which puts us here. Less than 29, no discomfort. This is a very comfortable day. But let's just take a day like we might have had over summer, where the humidity might have still been around 80%, so that's again that row through there, but the temperature might have been around 38 degrees. And suddenly, we're in the red zone, which actually what the red zone means, or the orange zone, actually is dangerous to bodily health. The red zone means it's actually extremely dangerous, and what you might be facing is the prospect of death through heat exhaustion. And what this guy here illustrates is that we've had hundreds of thousands of those already on our planet because of global temperature changes. And just recently they had the hottest temperature ever recorded in India, 51 degrees. And I look at that and think, how do you survive that? Well, you can survive 51 degrees if the humidity is really low. But if the humidity is not low, it's unsurvivable. And hence the title of his book, The Uninhabitable Planet. Which means that places like, with high humidity, eastern seaboard of Australia, when there's a heat wave and blowing the heat in, if the humidity's high, then it's not safe to go and work outside that day. So what do? We just lie under the air conditioner and try and stay cool. But that's our world. We've always believed that the earth would be destroyed and would get worse. And we believe that Jesus is coming, and we believe that we see all of these things as a sign that the end is nigh, and it is. It can't go on much longer. But the fact that the earth is falling apart is really a moot point, and is a proof that Jesus is coming soon. But the fact that we've been believing this now for 164 plus years should give us pause to think. Because if we don't start actually being active about caring for the environment, what if another 100 years goes by and your great-great-grandkids are now inhabiting a world where we're underwater? That this would be an absolute waterfront block. It's like they're possibilities in the scheme of things if things just continue as they are. Now, Revelation's final message is a call to worship the Creator who made heaven and earth, the springs and the fountains of the deep, and to call all of the earth to worship the Creator. Surely as part of that, and don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that we do the bohemian thing and actually start worshipping the creation. It's not that at all. But surely as part of the worship of the Creator needs to be a far greater respect of His creation. And that somehow rather that we make decisions and choices that turn us into being great respecters of our environment. We've got ADRA. It's great work. And it's about our being a brother's keeper. I wonder whether we should have a IPRA, which could be our part of being good stewards on the earth. I don't know. I just wonder. So what are our environmental care minimums? And that little mountain there is the needle. That might be the last bit left of Rarotonga that's still, if the predictions come true, and I don't know whether they are or not. And I don't know where you sit on the issues of climate change and heat, global warming. So don't get me wrong, whether you believe it or not, let's do something about our environment anyway. Because I think that makes good sense theologically for us to do so. So I think our minimum should be that we should protect plants and animals. We should plant new habitat. We should be part of those who educate people. We should reduce our waste. We should eliminate plastic, single-use plastic in particular. We should keep streams and lakes clean. We should get up and involved in Clean Up Australia Day and getting involved in those kinds of things. We should try and go carbon neutral if we can, or put solar panels on our roof, or whatever we can do to actually begin to reduce our footprint. The Maoris have a term, kaitaia kaitanga, and it's basically a term that means we are the guardians of the planet. And our guardianship is to ensure that what we leave for future generations will still be there in just as pristine a condition. They haven't always done real well at following through their own word. Challenge is for us to do something like that. Look at this list. Greater bilby, numbat, leadbeaters, possum, bandicoots, Lumholtz tree kangaroo, Australian sea lion, Tasmanian devil, even our koala, all threatened. Threatened species. In fact, we're on the verge of a mass extinction of so many species that scientists are calling it the next great extinction. And our response, start at home, at church, at school, plant gardens. I love this. Look at that image there. That's in Los Angeles. That's a church in Los Angeles. It's called the Dream Center. Check them out online. Incredible. What they do in serving humanity, and here they are, they've planted a garden in the center of LA. Walk or ride a bike, take a bus, save power, care enough to take the next step. Start writing to politicians demanding that they take action. Get involved in local efforts, just do something. And here's some things that I think the local church could do. I think the top one should be a matter of priority. I don't know how many places that I've visited in our conference where I go and there's a fellowship lunch, and it's all on single-use plastic plates with plastic spoons, and then there's this giant bag of rubbish at the end that they take that and throw it in the trash, and that'll end up floating around somewhere because it doesn't break down. We've got to do better. We've got to be much smarter. We've got to actually start caring for the things that God created instead of destroying it. I was, and I'm about to finish, just in case you're, getting worried about Neil having his rant. I flew down to Adelaide in March this year or late March, to go to Joel Slade's ordination. He was one of our pastors. He's now youth director down there, and I went down there to represent our conference. And while I'm there, I got this Jetstar magazine. It's fabulous. And in the middle of this, on page 16, there's this absolutely incredible thing. It's called forest bathing. No, it's not anything to do with, strange practices of going for a swim in the bush. Don't worry about that. But what it is people, seriously, it's a big thing. People pay money to people like Dave and others, and, you think of people here in church who know a thing or two about the outdoors. So they'll come and they'll pay you money for a guided tour outdoors so they can go and bathe themselves in the outdoors for a day. You know what I'd call that? Sabbath keeping. People are going to pay to keep Sabbath so they can escape the cities. And Adventists, we should so be all over this. We should be signing them up in their droves saying, hey, come Forest Bay with us. Because we will not just introduce you to the bush and teach you about the bush and how to live in harmony with it and how to just soak it in and how to get up close and personal to a tree and touch and hug a tree and to know that the little insects that do the squiggly bark thing and all of that. We could unlock so much of that because we've been teaching it to our kids in Pathfinders for years. And now who would have thought, but you could actually start selling that to happy little pagans who actually want to get out of doors and go somewhere, and at the same time we could introduce them to the Creator. I would call that environmental evangelism. Someone ought to be all over that, right? It's just fabulous. And you could start this little eco-theology business where we actually, with really good business practice, actually introduce people to God and people would pay for the experience. I hope today that I've actually given you cause for thought to actually think about how you're living. And the fact that the God that we love and that we serve actually wants us not just caring for each other in brotherly, sisterly love, because that is the law of Christ for us to do that. But it's also to do the same for His creation, to love it, to nurture it, to take care of it and tend it, to do all of those things. And why? Because we can. Church, I want to encourage you to write letters, to become an activist, to demand that your local church eliminate all plastic if they haven't already, for you to eliminate as much plastic as you can in your home, to just start doing simple things but follow them through, to realize that we've got Sabbath keepers in the Pacific Islands today who in the next 20 years may lose their home. Like, you realize Miami City most days has flood water coming in from rising sea level. It's just like, we can't bury our head in the sand and say this stuff isn't happening, because it actually is. And we've got Adventist brothers and sisters who will lose their homes, their livelihoods, their homeland because of what's taking place around us. I think the time for us not to do anything is long gone. The time for us to actually start taking an active role in living our faith and by encouraging others to do the same is here with us. And we can do that in a way which is consistent with all that we've taught and all that we've believed for a very long time. May God bless you as you think about these things today.